Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're diving into a world many of you might be familiar with or dreading, the U.S. visa interview.
Oh, yeah.
You sent us a really intriguing clip from EnglishPod, an English language learning podcast, and they actually do a mock visa interview. I thought it was brilliant. It really highlights how something seemingly straightforward can be surprisingly complex.
It is, isn't it? And you're right. The EnglishPod example is perfect for this. It's not just about having your paperwork in order.
Right.
It's about navigating a conversation where cultural awareness, clear communication, and even a bit of psychology come into play.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The mock interview on EnglishPod focuses on a B2 visa, which is for tourists.
Right.
And Liam and Emma, the podcast hosts, specifically mentioned that the interviewee has an accent. What does that tell us right off the bat?
It immediately throws in the element of communication across cultures and accents. Think about it. Even in a practice scenario, they're acknowledging that accents can impact how you're perceived and understood. And in a real visa interview where the stakes are so high, that pressure intensifies.
Right. It's like you're already nervous about the interview itself, and then you layer on this potential for misunderstanding because of an accent.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how often those kinds of miscommunications happen in real-life interviews.
More often than you'd think, unfortunately. And that's why the EnglishPod example is so valuable. It gives us a chance to analyze those potential pitfalls and think about how to navigate them.
Exactly. So they talk about the B2 visa, but they also mention F1 and J1 visas, which are for students and exchange visitors.
Right.
I remember feeling so much anxiety when I was applying for my student visa years ago.
Absolutely. Each visa type carries a weight of expectation and often a lot of personal hopes and dreams. For a student applying for an F1 visa, it's not just about getting permission to enter the U.S.
Right.
It's about the chance to pursue an education, build a future. The interview becomes a gateway to those aspirations.
And for someone on a J1, maybe it's about a once-in-a-lifetime chance to experience another culture or contribute to a research project. It's not just ticking boxes on a form. It's about the future you're trying to create.
Precisely. And that's where the human element comes in. The visa officer isn't just looking at documents. They're trying to assess your intentions, your credibility, your potential contribution. And all of that has to be conveyed through communication, often in a language that might not be your native tongue.
It makes you realize how much pressure is on the applicant to articulate their story, their purpose, their genuineness, all within the confines of this formal interview.
And to do it in a way that resonates with the interviewer, who might come from a completely different cultural background with different communication styles and expectations. It's a fascinating dynamic.
So how do we unpack that dynamic? What can we learn from the EnglishPod mock interview about how to effectively communicate in this high-pressure situation, especially when accents are involved?
Well, what's fascinating about the EnglishPod example is that they actually highlight a few key moments where the interviewee's accent almost leads to a misunderstanding. It's subtle, but it's there.
Okay.
And by analyzing those moments, we can start to uncover some really valuable insights.
All right, I'm hooked. Let's dive into those specific moments from the EnglishPod interview. What were some of the phrases or interactions that stood out to you?
There's a point where the interviewee uses a colloquialism that the interviewer doesn't quite grasp. It's a common phrase in the interviewee's culture, but it causes a momentary pause in the conversation. That's a perfect example of how even small language nuances can have an impact.
Oh, that's a great example. It's like, you might not even realize you're using language that could be misinterpreted or misunderstood.
Yeah.
I'm guessing those kinds of situations happen all the time in real visa interviews.
All the time. And that's why it's so important to not only be aware of your own communication style, but also to be prepared for those moments of potential confusion.
So what's the takeaway here for our listener who might be facing a visa interview in the future?
I'd say awareness is key. Be mindful of the words you choose, especially if they're culturally specific. And don't be afraid to politely clarify if you sense that something hasn't been understood.
That's such a good point. It's about being proactive in the communication process, not just passively hoping for the best.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that clear communication is a shared responsibility. Both the interviewer and the interviewee need to be actively engaged in ensuring that the message is being conveyed and received accurately.
All right, so we've touched on the different types of visas and the added pressure of communicating with an accent.
Yeah.
But what about the bigger picture? What's the overarching goal of the visa interview from the perspective of the visa officer?
Well, as we hinted at earlier, it's about assessing credibility and intentions. They're looking for inconsistencies, anything that raises a red flag.
Okay, so it's not just about checking boxes and making sure your paperwork is in order.
Not at all. It's about piecing together a puzzle. They're trying to understand who you are, why you want to enter the U.S., and whether your story aligns with the requirements of the visa you're applying for.
So it's like a mini investigation. That sounds pretty intense.
In a way, yes. And that's why preparation is so important. The more you understand the purpose of the interview, the better equipped you'll be to navigate it successfully.
All right, let's talk about preparation. What are some concrete things our listener can do to prepare for their visa interview?
Well, first and foremost, know the specific requirements for your visa category. What documents are needed? What are the key eligibility criteria? Once you have that foundation, you can start to anticipate the types of questions you might be asked.
So it's about researching your specific visa category and then almost reverse engineering the interview right. Thinking about what the interviewer might be looking for and preparing your answers accordingly.
Exactly. It's about putting yourself in their shoes and understanding their perspective.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And what about the actual interview itself? Were there any strategies for communicating effectively, especially if you have an accent or are nervous about being misunderstood?
Absolutely. And this is where practicing beforehand can be invaluable. Even something as simple as recording yourself answering common interview questions can be incredibly helpful.
Wait, really? Just recording yourself and listening back. Why is that so helpful?
It allows you to hear yourself the way others hear you. You might be surprised by how your accent sounds or how certain phrases come across. It gives you a chance to adjust your pronunciation, your pace, your word choice to ensure that you're communicating as clearly as possible.
Wow, that's such a simple but brilliant tip. I never thought of that. It's like giving yourself a mini mock interview and then having the opportunity to critique and refine your responses.
Precisely. And it allows you to get comfortable with the flow of the interview, to anticipate potential questions, and to build your confidence, especially if you're worried about your accent. This kind of practice can be incredibly reassuring.
So we've talked about preparation, but what about the emotional side of things? Visa interviews can be incredibly nerve-wracking, especially if you're already feeling anxious about your accent or potential cultural misunderstandings.
You're absolutely right. The emotional aspect is huge, and one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give is to try to stay calm and focused. Remember, the visa officer is just doing their job. They're not there to trick you or make you feel uncomfortable.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to get caught up in the pressure and forget that the interviewer is also just a person trying to do their best in a sometimes challenging situation.
Exactly. And if you can approach the interview with that mindset, with a sense of respect and understanding, it can go a long way in diffusing any tension and fostering a more positive interaction.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about different visa types, the importance of clear communication, especially when accents are involved, and some practical tips for preparing for the interview. But I'm curious, what are some common misconceptions people have about visa interviews?
One of the biggest misconceptions is that the visa officer is looking for reasons to deny your application.
Oh, really?
While they do have to be thorough, their primary goal is to assess your eligibility and make a fair decision based on the information presented.
So it's not like they're starting from a place of suspicion.
Not at all. They approach each interview with a neutral stance, and it's up to the applicant to demonstrate their qualifications and intentions.
That's reassuring to know. And what about the idea that having an accent will automatically hurt your chances? Is that true?
It's a common fear, especially for those who aren't native English speakers. But remember, clear communication is a two-way street. While it's important to articulate your answers, clearly the visa officer is also responsible for ensuring understanding.
So if they're not understanding you, it's okay to politely ask for clarification or rephrase your answer.
Absolutely. And it might even demonstrate your ability to adapt and communicate effectively, which can be a positive thing.
That's a really empowering message. It's like you're not powerless in this situation. You have agency and the ability to advocate for yourself.
Exactly. And that confidence can make a big difference in how you're perceived. Remember, the visa interview is a conversation. It's a chance to present your case, to tell your story, and to demonstrate why you deserve to be granted a visa.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's not just a test you have to pass. It's an opportunity to showcase who you are and what you bring to the table.
Precisely. And that shift in perspective can make all the difference in how you approach the interview and ultimately how you feel about the entire process.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the complexities involved in a visa interview, and I'm sure our listener does too.
And hopefully they're starting to see the bigger picture here, that even seemingly simple interactions can be far more intricate than they appear.
So true. But we've only just scratched the surface, haven't we? There's still so much more to uncover about the nuances of communication, cultural awareness, and the psychology at play in a visa interview.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll be diving into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring specific examples from the EnglishPod mock interview, analyzing those moments where communication could have gone awry, and offering concrete strategies for navigating those potential pitfalls.
I can't wait. It's like we're detectives piecing together a puzzle, uncovering the hidden layers of meaning and communication in this seemingly straightforward interaction. Stay tuned, listeners, because it's about to get really interesting.
So picking up where we left off, let's revisit that EnglishPod mock interview. Remember, they set it up with an interviewee who has an accent, which adds this whole other layer of complexity to the interaction.
Right. And I remember you mentioning that there are a few moments in the interview where the accent almost leads to a misunderstanding. Can we dive into those specifics? Because I think that's where the real learning happens.
Yeah.
Seeing how those nuances can actually play out in a real conversation.
Absolutely. There's this one moment where the interviewee is explaining their travel plans, and they use the phrase popover to describe a quick visit to a neighboring state.
Okay.
Now, in their native language and culture, that phrase might be perfectly commonplace, but to the interviewer's ear, it sounds a bit casual, almost flippant. And you can almost feel this little bit of tension in the air as the interviewer tries to clarify what the interviewee means.
Oh, wow, I see what you mean. It's like the interviewee is just using a normal expression from their everyday language, but in the context of this formal interview, it comes across differently. It makes you wonder if they even realize how their words might be interpreted.
And that's the thing, isn't it? We often don't realize how much our cultural background and language habits influence our communication style. And in a situation like a visa interview where every word matters, those subtle nuances can have a real impact.
So what's the takeaway for our listener here? How can they avoid those kinds of miscommunications if they're in a similar situation?
It's a great question, and it goes back to that awareness we were talking about earlier. If you know you have an accent or tend to use colloquialisms, it's helpful to be extra mindful of your word choice in a formal setting, like an interview. Think about how your words might be perceived by someone from a different background.
So it's almost like having two sets of ears, right? Your own ears and the ears of the listener who might be hearing your words through a completely different cultural and linguistic filter.
Exactly. And it's not about changing who you are or erasing your accent. It's about being aware of the potential for miscommunication and taking steps to bridge that gap. Sometimes it might be as simple as explaining a colloquialism or choosing a more formal synonym.
It sounds like a lot of it comes down to that active listening and being willing to clarify if you sense any confusion on the part of the listener.
Precisely. And it goes both ways, of course. Yeah. The interviewer should also be actively listening, asking for clarification, and trying to understand the interviewee's perspective.
Okay, so that's one example. Were there any other moments in the EnglishPod interview where the accent almost tripped things up?
Yes. There's another point where the interviewee is talking about their financial situation, and they use a term that's specific to their country's banking system. Again, it's something that's perfectly clear to them, but the interviewer has no frame of reference for it. And you can hear the interviewee getting a little flustered as they try to explain it, which of course just makes the situation more stressful.
Oh, I can totally relate to that.
Yeah.
I remember when I was traveling abroad and I kept using banking terms that people just didn't understand. It's so frustrating when you feel like you can't explain something simple because of a language barrier.
And it's that frustration, that feeling of not being understood, that can really throw you off in an already high-pressure situation like a visa interview.
So what's the solution? How can you prepare for those moments when you know you're going to have to explain something that's culturally or linguistically specific?
Well, one strategy is to anticipate those potential stumbling blocks. If you know you're going to have to talk about your finances, for example, think about the terms you might need to use and how you might explain them in a way that's clear to someone who isn't familiar with your country's banking system.
So it's almost like doing a mini translation in your head, right? Taking a concept that's familiar to you and finding a way to express it in a way that will make sense to someone from a different background.
Exactly. And it might involve using analogies, providing context, or breaking down complex concepts into simpler terms.
Okay, so we've talked about anticipating potential language barriers and being prepared to clarify or rephrase. But are there any other strategies our listener can use to communicate more effectively in a visa interview, especially if they're worried about their accent?
Absolutely. One thing that often gets overlooked is the power of nonverbal communication. Things like eye contact, facial expressions, and body language can play a huge role in conveying your message and building rapport with the interviewer.
That's so true. I've definitely been in situations where I could tell that someone wasn't understanding my words, but they could still sense my sincerity or my enthusiasm through my nonverbal cues. It's like communication goes beyond just the words we speak.
Absolutely. And in a visa interview where you're trying to convey not just information, but also your genuine intentions, your passion, your credibility, those nonverbal signals can be incredibly powerful.
So how can our listener use nonverbal communication to their advantage in a visa interview?
Well, first and foremost, maintain good eye contact. It shows that you're engaged, attentive, and confident. But be mindful of cultural differences here. In some cultures, direct eye contact might be considered rude or aggressive, so it's always good to do a little research beforehand to understand the norms of the culture you're interacting with.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
What might be considered polite in one culture could be interpreted as disrespectful in another. It's about being sensitive to those nuances and adapting your communication style accordingly.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just eye contact. Think about your facial expressions. Are you smiling? Do you look approachable and friendly? Or are you frowning or looking tense? Your facial expressions can convey a lot about your emotional state, and they can either help or hinder your ability to connect with the interviewer.
Right. It's like if you're smiling and looking genuinely happy to be there, it sends a message of openness and warmth that can really help to put the interviewer at ease.
And don't underestimate the power of body language. Sit up straight. Make sure you're facing the interviewer and use hand gestures to emphasize your points. But again, be aware of cultural differences. Some gestures that might be perfectly harmless in your culture could be offensive in another.
Okay, so we've covered eye contact, facial expressions, and body language. Are there any other nonverbal cues that our listeners should be aware of?
Well, one that's particularly relevant when you're dealing with language barriers is mirroring. It's a subconscious behavior where we tend to mimic the posture and gestures of the person we're interacting with. It's a way of building rapport and showing that we're on the same wavelength.
Oh, that's fascinating. So if the interviewer is leaning forward and I subtly lean forward too, it creates a sense of connection and understanding.
Exactly. And it can be especially helpful in situations where verbal communication is challenging. By mirroring the interviewer's body language, you're sending a nonverbal signal that you're listening, that you're engaged, and that you're trying to connect with them on a deeper level.
Wow. It's amazing how much communication happens beneath the surface, isn't it? It's like we're constantly sending and receiving signals without even realizing it.
It is, and the more we understand those subtle cues, the more effectively we can communicate, especially in challenging situations like a visa interview.
So we've talked a lot about the interviewee's perspective, but what about the interviewer? What are some things they can do to ensure clear communication, especially when the interviewee has an accent or is from a different cultural background?
Well, one of the most important things is to be patient and understanding. Remember, the interviewee might be nervous, they might be struggling to find the right words, and they might be feeling self-conscious about their accent.
Right. It's like they're already in this high pressure situation, and then they have this added layer of anxiety about being misunderstood because of their accent or cultural background.
Yeah.
It's a lot to handle.
It is, and that's why it's so important for the interviewer to create a welcoming and supportive environment. Simple things like smiling, making eye contact, and using encouraging body language can go a long way in putting the interviewee at ease.
It's like you're sending a nonverbal message that says, I'm here to listen. I'm here to understand, and I want you to succeed.
Exactly. And that can make all the difference in the world.
All right, so we're back, and I'm really excited to dive into this next layer of the visa interview puzzle. We've talked about the practicalities, the language nuances, but now let's get into the psychology of it all.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because beneath the surface of this formal interaction, there's this whole undercurrent of emotions, perceptions, and cultural influences at play.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes the EnglishPod example so compelling. You can almost feel the tension and the vulnerability of the interviewee as they navigate this high-stakes conversation, especially with the added pressure of communicating with an accent.
Absolutely. Imagine you're the interviewee in that scenario. You've likely invested a lot of time, money, and emotional energy into this visa application. It's tied to your dreams, your aspirations, maybe even your entire future.
Right, and then you're in this unfamiliar environment facing an authority figure who holds the power to grant or deny your request. It's a recipe for stress and anxiety.
And that stress can manifest in so many ways. It can affect your ability to think clearly, to articulate your thoughts, to even understand the questions being asked.
It's like your brain goes into fight or flight mode, and suddenly you can't remember simple words or phrases. I know I've definitely had those moments where my mind just goes blank under pressure.
And that's where things can get really tricky, especially if you're already dealing with the added pressure of communicating in a language that's not your native tongue.
So what happens when you combine that stress response with the complexities of cross-cultural communication?
Well, it can create a perfect storm for misunderstanding. Think about it. You're nervous. You're trying to process information in a language that might not be completely familiar, and you're hyper aware of your accent and how you're being perceived.
Right. It's like all of your insecurities are magnified in that moment. And on the flip side, the interviewer might also be bringing their own biases and assumptions to the table.
Exactly. We all have unconscious biases, and those biases can be triggered by things like accents, cultural background, even body language.
So it's like this invisible layer of perception is influencing the entire interaction, shaping how the interviewer views the interviewee and vice versa.
Precisely, and that's why it's so crucial to be aware of these dynamics, both from the perspective of the interviewee and the interviewer.
Okay, so let's break this down. What are some specific things that the interviewee can do to manage their stress and anxiety in a visa interview?
Well, one of the most effective strategies is preparation. The more prepared you are, the more confident you'll feel, and less likely you are to be overwhelmed by stress. This means researching the visa requirements, thoroughly practicing your answers to common interview questions, and even doing some role-playing with a friend or family member.
So it's about familiarizing yourself with the process, anticipating potential questions, and having those responses ready to go.
Exactly. And it's not just about memorizing answers, it's about internalizing the information, understanding the logic behind the questions, and being able to articulate your thoughts and intentions clearly and concisely.
It's like the more comfortable you are with the material, the less likely you are to get flustered or thrown off by unexpected questions.
Precisely. And beyond preparation, there are other things you can do to manage your anxiety in the moment. Deep breathing exercises, visualization techniques, even just taking a few moments to center yourself before the interview can make a huge difference.
It's like you're giving your nervous system a chance to calm down and reset before you enter that high-pressure situation.
And it's also about shifting your mindset. Instead of viewing the interview as a test you have to pass, try to see it as an opportunity to share your story, to connect with another human being, and to advocate for yourself and your dreams.
I love that. It's about reframing the narrative and focusing on the positive aspects of the experience.
And remember, it's okay to be nervous. It's a natural human response to a stressful situation. The key is to not let that nervousness control you.
So we've talked about managing stress from the interviewee's perspective. But what about the interviewer? What can they do to create a more welcoming and supportive environment?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, it starts with awareness. Recognizing that the interviewee might be feeling anxious and trying to put them at ease. Simple gestures like smiling, making eye contact, and using a friendly tone of voice can go a long way.
It's about creating a sense of warmth and humanity in what can often feel like a very sterile and intimidating environment.
And it's also about being patient and understanding. If the interviewee is struggling to find the right words, or if their accent is making it difficult to understand them, don't rush them or make them feel self-conscious. Give them the time and space they need to express themselves.
It's about recognizing that communication is a two-way street and that the interviewer has a responsibility to ensure that the conversation is flowing smoothly.
Exactly. And if you're struggling to understand the interviewee, don't be afraid to ask for clarification. You could say something like, "I'm sorry, could you please repeat that? I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly."
Right. It's about being honest about your own difficulty understanding and working together to bridge that communication gap.
And it's also about being mindful of your own body language and tone of voice. Are you coming across as judgmental or impatient? Or are you conveying a sense of openness and empathy?
It's like you're setting the tone for the entire interaction with your nonverbal cues. If you're projecting warmth and understanding, it's more likely that the interviewee will feel comfortable and relaxed.
And that can make all the difference in the quality of the communication and ultimately the outcome of the interview.
So what are some key takeaways for our listener, whether they're preparing for a visa interview themselves or simply trying to understand the complexities of cross-cultural communication?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that communication is a lot more nuanced than we often realize. It's not just about the words we speak, it's about the emotions we convey, the cultural context we bring to the table, and the unconscious biases that shape our perceptions.
It's like there's this whole hidden layer of meaning that's being communicated beneath the surface of our words.
Exactly. And the more we understand those hidden layers, the more effectively we can navigate those tricky cross-cultural interactions.
And I think another key takeaway is the importance of empathy. Whether you're the interviewee or the interviewer, trying to see the world from the other person's perspective, understanding their challenges and recognizing their humanity can make a huge difference in the quality of the communication and the outcome of the interaction.
Absolutely. Empathy is the foundation of effective communication, especially in situations where there's potential for misunderstanding.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for the complexities of the visa interview process, and I'm sure our listener has too.
And hopefully they'll walk away from this conversation feeling more prepared, more confident, and more aware of the subtle dynamics that shape our communication with others.
And you know what? It makes you wonder, what other everyday interactions are more complex than they seem? That's something to think about. Until next time, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
See you next time.